Vyacheslav Potapenko is joining us, Deputy Director of the National Institute for Strategic Studies. Hello, Vyacheslav.
Hello.
Good morning.
Let's start with this. The summit of the G7 top diplomats has already concluded. It's over. Andriy Sybiha, the head of the MFA of Ukraine, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, MFA is the Ukrainian abbreviation, yes, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine. He has already shared and conveyed many positive messages to journalists following the results. One of them is the understanding and overall realization among the G7 representatives that it is necessary to put more pressure on Russia because everyone can now see that it is Russia that does not want to end this war against Ukraine. Do they have anything left to pressure with, in your opinion?
Well, unfortunately, as of today, the situation is such that the United States of America is more inclined to the point of view that it is Ukraine that should make concessions. And the Europeans, for their part, tend to agree with Ukraine that it is necessary to put pressure on the Russian Federation. But as far as I understand, their real capabilities have been exhausted, and now, economically, they can neither participate in hostilities nor completely refuse, so to speak, the grey imports of Russian oil. Therefore, in fact, I think their resources are largely depleted here. They also didn't vote for the next round of sanctions. And so for now, it mostly comes down to European statements about the need to put pressure on Russia and American, so to speak, moderation aimed at putting more pressure on those who depend on them more, in other words, on Ukraine. Well, that's more or less how I see the situation.
Vyacheslav, lately we've been hearing and seeing a lot of reports that military aid to Ukraine might be reduced because of the war and the conflict in Iran. In your opinion, to what extent is the information space being filled with this news? Or is this really something that Ukraine should expect? And indeed, is there a trend where partners purchase weapons from the United States for Ukraine, but these weapons never actually reach Ukraine? How great is the risk that this will actually happen?
Well, to begin with, in reality, all of this is considered a state secret in many countries. And, well, the information we receive is, well, not always reliable. We can't even theoretically obtain all the information, so we are mostly discussing what gets leaked to the media. In principle, Europe has given a lot of weapons to Ukraine over these 4 years, and faced with the Russian threat, they are, of course, replenishing their own stockpiles. That is, as long as it was about modernized Soviet weaponry, they were quite willing to transfer it to Ukraine. When it was about old American weapons from the Cold War era, that was also quite sufficient. But those Cold War stockpiles, even if modernized, have been depleted, and now we're talking about new weapons. And mostly, new weapons have been filling up Europe's arsenals in exchange for the old armaments transferred to Ukraine. Now, well, it's actually quite difficult for them given the threat from the Russian Federation when all these diagrams are being published showing which arrows point to Riga, which to Vilnius, Russian attacks, and so on. It's pretty hard for them to explain to their voters why they plan to send weapons to Ukraine instead of keeping them for themselves. So, well, it's not a risk. It's just normal political behavior for people who have been democratically elected to these positions. In fact, they simply can't act any other way. That's it. Then secondly, the United States of America is expending quite large amounts of weaponry, which, unlike this classified information, can actually be tracked by the launches. There are websites, so it's more or less clear what quantities of weaponry are being used. Based on 4 years of supply experience, it's also roughly clear what the production volumes are. And it's clear that the US has indeed spent a lot of weapons. If the US decides to launch a ground operation in Iran, then most likely, of course, it's unlikely they will be able to sell weapons in the same volumes as they did under the Pearl program. So I look at this situation as such. It's difficult to maintain the previous volume of supplies, and it will continue to decrease just as it did before. For example, in 25, it was less than in 24. And in 26, it will be less than in 25. That's how it is. But there are technological changes happening as well. Ukraine is significantly shifting towards drones, which it largely either produces itself or adapts, developing its own tactics. Moreover, it shares these technologies with the Gulf monarchies. 70% of enemy personnel losses are caused by drones. Therefore, in fact, the war is gradually shifting to new types of weaponry, which means that Ukraine is less dependent on the United States and Europe for supplies in this regard. And they are obviously cheaper. So it's not accurate to say that Ukraine will be left completely without weapons. But when we talk about missiles for anti-missile systems, yes, for Patriot systems, which are also used in this way and so on, here indeed we are talking about the fact that there may be some difficulties. The volumes will most likely decrease, and to some extent this will be replaced by new, cheaper types of weaponry in the form of drones. Drones as systems for counter-drone defense and anti-missile defense. But it's better to discuss this with engineers and specialists. But overall, we are seeing a certain technological transformation, not just an attempt, but the possibility of replacing expensive Western weaponry with cheaper and quite effective, and in some cases even more effective, counterparts that have been developed, adapted, and tested in Ukraine.
To end the war, it is necessary to implement a strategy that includes increasing economic pressure on Russia and providing Kyiv with an effective deterrence package. This was stated by Ukraine's Minister of Foreign Affairs Andriy Sybiha during a session in support of Ukraine with the foreign ministers of the G7 countries. And according to him, the deterioration of Russia's position on the battlefield and in the economy can force the Kremlin to seek peace. And in this context, any steps to ease pressure on the aggressor are counterproductive. Let's listen to his direct speech and discuss it.
We have entered a phase where Russia's winter terror has been defeated, and Russia is losing more than 30,000 occupiers every month and more territory than it captures. Russia is trying to weaken sanctions and profit from high oil prices. Putin is seeking to prolong not only his war against Ukraine, but also in the Middle East. For our part, we are not going to ease our own pressure. On the contrary, strikes deep inside Russia will only intensify. It is only fair that the war returns to where it came from. Andriy Sybiha, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
Here are Ukrainian drone strikes on oil terminals, sanctions, delays of the shadow fleet, detainment of the shadow fleet. All this collaboration, these joint actions, do you think they can influence Putin?
Problems for the Russian Federation? Well, I mean, unfortunately, they won't directly affect the fighting in Donbass. But they certainly do affect the overall economic and political situation in Russia and in the world as a whole. As for the shadow fleet, what's happening now is essentially a war between the global West and the global South. If the global West stops tankers of unclear ownership carrying Russian oil, then, for example, in the Strait of Hormuz, Western tankers carrying oil from the Emirates, Kuwait, and so on are being stopped. That's why the confrontation there is escalating. And the main difficulty here is that reducing the supply of Russian oil leads to higher oil prices, including in the European Union countries and the United States of America, because Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz affects this, and the lack of supplies from Russia also negatively impacts the situation. Therefore, to what extent the West will be able to withstand this sanctions regime in relation to Russian oil also raises questions.
Yes.
Here. And so, yes, huge problems have been created for Russia. Shelling deep into the territory has become more and more effective and is causing more and more economic damage here. But since the country is large, the system is large, and generally speaking, not all forces are involved in the fighting, well, they are able to find reserves to maintain the same level of activity on the Russian-Ukrainian front and to carry out strikes deep into Ukrainian territory targeting infrastructure.
Well, these strikes, yes, are not only symbolic, but also have an economic impact, which is a good thing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Vyacheslav Potapenko, Deputy Director of the National Institute for Strategic Studies, was with us on the line.